Our pre-conference was funded by a new European grant with a quite complicated title. It is Creativity and Adaptability as Conditions of the Success of Europe in an Interrelated World. Sorry, I'm just learning this because this is the very first conference of the project, which is just starting. It's a huge project including about 100 scholars, the biggest humanities grant probably ever awarded in the Czech Republic. And with our colleagues, we have one more package in this huge project, which is focusing on screen industries in East Central Europe, or small media markets in East Central Europe. And our aim is to work closely with the industry to produce industry reports for public institutions, industry associations, and even companies, to look at critical problems distributors, producers, filmmakers are facing these days, but also produce academic publications and conferences and workshops and so on. So we are going until 2022. So we hope to have at least 4 more conferences like this, maybe in the same place, in this movie theater, hopefully. So some of you might be coming next year, I hope. One of the activities related to this project is a book which will include some of the papers or articles based on the chapters based on the papers which will be presented in this conference. We will talk to you individually about the book. It's called Digital Peripheries, the online circulation of audiovisual content from the small market perspective. So it's not just East Central Europe, it's a small media market perspective on the changes, transformations of online distribution, internet television, and also on the possible impacts of the digital single market strategy, the strategy regulatory initiative of the European Commission. That's the book which is preliminarily planned for a new book series initiated by Springer, and its editor is here. Ulrike will tell you later about the book series. It's not set yet, but we hope to have the book in this book series. 2019 possibly. There will be also a special issue of a Czech film studies journal Iluminace with a selection of papers from this conference. So some of you might be interested in publishing in the journal, some of you may be in the book. The last initiative related to this project I would like to mention is a joint degree international PhD program focusing on screen industries in Eastern Europe or small markets, and we hope to prepare an accreditation, a new PhD program, which will be probably the first English language PhD program on media industries or typical media industry studies in this part of Europe. So this will go on. This will take some time, probably 3 or 4 years before we can start this with actually accepting students. So that's about all the organizational issues I wanted to mention, I think. I would like to thank the National Film Archive for hosting us here. Both universities, Charles University in Prague and Palacký University in Olomouc, for co-funding the conference. And the floor is open for the first panel. So thank you very much for coming to Prague.
I'll start with a word of thanks to Peter and Pavel and also to Paul Stetman for organising this event and giving us an opportunity to share ideas. So this first session is focusing on the digital single market strategy, which, as we know, is President Juncker's ambitious work programme to eradicate potential barriers to the single digital market, European digital markets, and to transform the competitive position of local EU digital players. So we have 4 quite varied papers. I see everybody's joining me on the stage now. That's fine. I'm going to immediately turn over to the first of our paper, but let me just say what the arrangement is, which is that each, so we have Marcin Adamczak is going to speak first, then we have 3 other speakers, in Ulrike's case, jointly presenting with Henry. Each of these papers will be about 20 minutes. We'll have a response then from Paul Stepan, a brief response, and then it'll be over to you for questions and answers for 20 minutes or so. So without further ado, I'm happy to hand over to Marcin Adamczak. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for introduction. And the first paper will be about some general ideas behind of the digital single market, and my research was focused on Polish context, but I hope it's quite universal in case of the arguments of the film industry against the digital single market. So in case of digital single market, 3 pillars and 3 kinds of benefits of the new strategy are usually underlined, and they are at first access, means better access for consumers to digital goods and services across Europe, and second, creating the right conditions for digital networks and innovative services to develop, and then third, maximizing the growth potential of the digital economy. And obviously there is also rhetoric of digital revolution, new opportunities, and completely changed media environment and consumption practices. But the starting point of my paper is slightly different, and at the beginning I would like to mention the fact which is less emphasized up till now, and put DSM in context of 20th century cinema and film markets centered around cinemas, which could look as conservative, anachronistic, or even eccentric move. However, I think there is a strong connection, and DSM is not the first chapter of the story, but one of the subsequent chapters of long 100 years old story. And it's a story about archipelago, or to put it more precisely, about archipelago in the shadow of Hollywood. So after First World War, which brought disruption to French and Italian film industries, previously competitive to Hollywood studios at international market, European film industries found themselves in constant defense against hegemonic Big 8, then Big 6, finally Big 5 Hollywood studios. And the crucial disadvantage of Europe was fragmentation of film industries in terms both film production and local audiences, tastes and admissions. In case of film market, Europe has never been a continent, but the archipelago, I mean the bunch of separate islands. And on those islands, mainly 2 kinds of films were popular. It was Hollywood blockbusters, Hollywood big hits, and local hits. And there was not too many connections between islands, despite of long, constant, and sometimes wise efforts to integrate it into one entity, so to make archipelago the continent, in metaphorical terms, of course. And we could mention here the Film Europe movement in 20s, well described by Christine Thompson, the idea of mutual distribution agreements, the attempt to integrate the industry vertically and prepare it to international competition, like in ideas of Arthur J. Rank. And of course, co-productions, efforts to create European corporate companies like Studio Canal, and all pan-European support systems like Eurimages, Media2, and finally Creative Europe. And all of them failed because in traditional model of film business centered around cinemas and around basic principle of territoriality, no one was able to create united single film market, vertically integrated film companies operating across Europe and at least approximately integrated audiences. As a result, the only common mainstream European film culture was the Hollywood one, at least after 1980. And also as a result, for more than a quarter of the century, there is a structural inequality in European market, divided as follows: 60 to 70% for Hollywood output and 20 to 30% for local productions, and only small margin for other movies which can travel. But they are not frequent travelers, and we can show here a lot of data, like for example in 1999, according to Toby Miller, German and Spanish films had about a 0.3% market share of 5 other biggest European markets, and French ones hadn't more than 1.5% at the other European market. Italian films had 4% of market share in Spain, but didn't achieve more than 1.2% at any other. And according to data about VOD in 2016, EU films are available on VOD platforms in on average 2.8 countries. Co-produced films circulate on slightly higher levels in 3.6 states, while US films are typically available on VOD platforms in 6.8 EU countries. So we have another century and another technological environment, but here is a strong continuity of difficulties with traveling of European films despite the passage of years and profound technological changes. So one of the less emphasized aspects of the digital single market could be the final integration of European market and opportunity to make it competitive abroad. So the paradox is that film industry community is particularly opposed to new regulations, and my question is, what are their arguments? And at second, should we rethink the realm of contemporary film market in face of it? My paper is just the preliminary study, so as I mentioned, the research was not very wide and it's based on the case of Poland. However, I have this strong conviction that the arguments of film industry representatives are quite universal across Europe. And for the purpose of the paper, I conducted 3 semi-structured interviews with heads of 3 Polish distribution companies, Gutek Film, M2 Films, and Forum Film. And just to give you the picture of their position of the market, there is statistics from 2016. So we can see Forum Film is here, Gutek Film is here, and M2 Films is slightly below 1% of the market, so it's in others. And in 2017, it's quite similar. So definitely you can have the impression that they are companies from the bottom side of the market. However, their position is much more prominent, I think, that pure statistics can indicate. So Forum Film is one of the leaders for many years. It was the major in distribution. It was always top 5, top 3, top 4 since 90s. However, they lost the contract with Disney, so they just dropped in this position like 1, 2, 3% of the market. You can see here how important are the contracts with Hollywood still for the distributors in Europe. And Gutek Film is a really prominent art house distributor, the leader of the industry in this sector. And it's a very smartly designed company. I would like to call it like a vertical or maybe horizontally integrated in case of art house. So they are operating 3 very big film festivals. They have many very profitable projects funded by the state, I mean educational project. They are operating a few cinemas and they are the leader of the art house sector. And M2 Films is a very dynamic, very, I would like to say, dangerous for Gutek competitor for this art house sector. So just summary, they are more prominent than just the pure statistics would indicate. And before the arguments of the film industry, just also the short picture and overview of the VOD sector in Poland, which is not very well developed. And of course, the name of the companies are not meaningful for you and they are not important for you, but I think it's only one very important point. I mean the conglomerate structure and ownership and control of the VOD market. So we have only 4 kinds of entities in control of VOD market in Poland. So one of them are the internet portals, which are the owners of the VOD.pl and VP.tv. So they are like a very strong internet portals controlled by Axel Springer in one case and by International Venture Fund in the second case. And so that's the first kind of entities. Then there are the TV channels, the public TV channel, that's VOD TV.pl and the Player.pl and iPla, which are the most important public and private TV channels. Then you have global corporations like Netflix and Showmax. And probably the most interesting case is CDA.pl, because there is a pirate portal, but on the move to legalize their content and to legalize their operations. So part of the content is pirate and part of the content is legalized, and they are just shifting their focus to the legal part nowadays. And why it's important from my point of view, because no one from serious film distribution companies at Polish market is involved in VOD sector directly by establishing their own facility. They just sell content to other players, and there is a strong conviction that VOD is not profitable, and the clear tendency to neglect VOD revenues, generally perceived as peanuts among cinema distributors. And I suppose there is an interesting difference between at least Poland and Czech Republic. In my opinion, Poland is much less modernized or open for VOD than Czech Republic, and I think it needs the further elaboration and a comparative perspective, because it's difficult to point the clear factors which are decisive here. One of them should be the really impressive development of traditional cinematic market in Poland, which is developing in the pace unnoticeable any time before. And we can see the dynamics here. Usually Poland, in comparison to Czech Republic and Hungary, was always backward in case of the tickets per capita, which we can see here. And it was the situation, historically speaking, present before the Second World War, during the socialist times, and after 1989 as well. And nowadays there is like almost similar. So maybe that's today, it's our future. I mean that maybe the VOD is the future in Poland, but maybe there is like the divergent patterns that Poles are staying with this traditional former going out, and maybe other communities are more keen just to enjoy movies in comfortable households. But anyway, that's just my assumptions, because it needs further elaboration, and the point is only that Polish distributors are really not very enthusiastic about the VOD as a business opportunity and business perspective, and they are still focused on the traditional cinema as a major point of reference for them. And now going to the semi-structured interviews, I made 3 of them. Just another thing, I forgot that maybe it's also important for this neglecting of VOD, because since 2016, Poland's first time in the history is among the top 20 world markets, and that's again the really very good business time for the traditional distributors in Poland, and the reason for neglecting VOD and probably DSM as well. And going to semi-structured interviews, first of them was this Jakub Duszyński, who is the member of the board and the head of acquisition in Gutek Film Company. He is also second-time president of Europe Distributing Association, involved in the lobbying against the digital single market. And in his opinion, the regulations are unacceptable because of a few reasons. So the result will be the elimination of vast number of market players, first of all smaller distributors and producers. Then it will lead to reduction of diversity of European films, styles and aesthetics. And there will be just a few powerful corporations, corporate players, which will survive and will have the prominent leverage position over the producers. So the consequence will be the drop of prices for licenses. And the main role in his rhetoric is played by symbolic, of course, small black and white movie from Montenegro. And during preparing my paper and the presentation, I wasn't able to find any stills from small black and white movie from Montenegro, so we have instead small black and white movie from Poland. Very art house, very sophisticated, very unpopular at the market, and really badly received by the audience. So the DSM will annihilate small black and white film from Montenegro, or from Poland in this case, and the audience definitely lose the opportunity to see it. And Duszyński underlines the role of small local distributors, their knowledge about the local market, relations with cinema owners or programmers, and first of all, their efforts to search and promote previously unknown and unobvious art house films. Those distributors, in his view, are passionate about finding and building audience for it. And the strong role in his talk was played by the vision of diversity and fierce, healthy competition among minor distribution entities nowadays. Also, the interesting point in his arguments regarding the wider political issues in Poland was careful attention not to appear, quote, anti-European. So he was going back to phrases, I understand the European idea, we are very pro-European in our company, and so on. On the other hand, he expressed clearly that European politicians don't understand the film market, quote, the DSM is impossible to implement and it would have to adjust to industry members, end of quote, and that he had never heard during discussion with European politicians, quote, nothing else than general cliches, end of quote. He revealed that the strategy, at least the strategy of his organization, was to slow down the process as much as possible. And finally, he is also optimistic about not implementing DSM to film market because, quote, destructive activities are always without reason, end of quote. He expects that just the portability rule will be applied. And he presents also a strong stance at the end, quote, that territoriality, windows of release, and its chronology, primary position of cinema, and exclusive rights are necessary cornerstones of film business model, end of quote. The second interview was with Marcin Wąs, the CEO of M2 Films, the main competitor of Gutek Film, focused more on US indies than European art house. And his rhetoric was even stronger, quote, DSM is a nuclear bomb which hangs over the industry on the very thin line, and I mean not only distribution, but the whole set of rules on which the audiovisual sector was built all over the world, end of quote. He argued that DSM will limit pre-sales drastically, and as a result it will cause difficulties with closing budget and signing co-production deals. He expected that beneficiaries would be not only a few powerful corporations, as Duszyński said, but more precisely a few powerful US corporations. His opinion about European politicians were similar, and he blamed them for deep and complete misunderstanding of film industry. The CEO of M2 Films underlined also the fact of dispersion of tastes of local audiences in Europe and necessity to address it, which is realized in current model. He strongly opposed also the passive rights and accepts only portability rule as the justified one. And the crucial point of his arguments was the disruption of the logic of the current business model by DSM. He posed that even if 2 or 3 people will see his movies from, quote, Czech VOD provider, end of quote, it destroys the whole set of rules of trust, quote, I need the exclusive rights and I need to guarantee to my business partners in TV channels and VOD services. Without it, I can close my business, end of quote. The third interview was with Sławomir Salamon, a veteran, legendary distributor, one of the founders of distributor sector in Poland on basis of exclusive deals with Hollywood companies in the 90s. And his reasoning was very similar to those expressed in previous interviews. So territoriality and the exclusive rights were elevated as absolutely necessary rule for existence or perseverance of the business. However, off the record, he said also, it's nothing to worry about. DSM is outdated discussion, and the only danger now are abolishing windows and making day and date releases. So according to Salamon, we have a very outdated panel today because it's, anachronistic discussion according to him. And he perceived, which is quite interesting, he perceived abolishing windows and making day and date releases as a separate from DSM policy. And in summary, I have limited sources of 3 interviews, but the opinions were very coherent. Definitely all of them looks like status quo defenders, determined to save current film business model as the only which they can imagine as successful one. And again, metaphorically speaking and following the Benjamin Barber metaphors, this traditional model is like pipelines or railway tracks. I mean, it's necessary to control the physical infrastructure to deliver the physical artifact to the consumers. And the most important point is to control all the circulation of the product. And also the very interesting thing is quite peculiar vision expressed by Jakub Duszyński. He described the current European model in rather surprising terms. Small companies and fierce market competition, pure free market economy, flexible companies being deep into the rivalry like pre-modern European Italian city-states. He talked about self-regulated market as our contemporary reality. However, in the realm of European production and distribution, highly subsidized at national, pan-European and regional level, and the plethora of commissions and other bodies which decided about public support, it's difficult to impose the vision of self-regulated and strictly market-oriented reality. According to Toby Miller, the market noted €2 billion yearly deficit at the turn of centuries, and for sure the statistics didn't change. I would rather say that's the indicator of how comfortable and friendly industrial surroundings were created in Europe for industry players. And that's why maintaining status quo is so desirable among them. And it's also stunning how sure they are that they are free market, pure free market economy nowadays. And I would like to say it's like the first consciousness, because definitely they don't want to compete, they don't want to dream about expanding abroad, and they don't perceive the DSM as an opportunity to expand abroad. So they are not like entrepreneur approach anyway. And on the other hand, the DSM debate allows us also to appreciate investigate the state of European cinema in last of 10 or 15 years, even if we are not industry players. So there is a market inequality in face of Hollywood hegemon and permanent market crisis, but there is also the immense diversity of movies. So the point is, how much do we need this small black and white film from Montenegro or from Poland? Because I'm not completely sure about the lack of competence among European decision makers, which seems to be believed by Polish distributors. And maybe politicians just don't care about Kare's business model on minor and old industry. Maybe their stakes are simply higher because the decrease of number of film production and the reduction of small budgeted movies destined to make loss in box office and integration of the market were advised in expertise written to enhance European competitiveness in 90s. And DSM somehow unexpectedly seems to be fulfillment of old European dream about united continental market, but at the same time we could notice how ambiguous was this dream and could appear to be a nightmare. Strict corporate control over a limited and highly marketed bunch of audiovisual products, universality instead of rich diversification of styles and author points of views, and last but not least, preparing united market as a tasty apple just to drop into US corporate behemoth's basket. All of it could be the possible consequence according to Polish industry. However, the final point, at least based on the interviews with Polish distributors, is not so gloomy. They are opposition and they are talking about nuclear bomb hang on a very thin line, but at the same time they seem not to care too much. During interviews I had strong feeling that they would bet that DSM will not be implemented, or it would be in a very limited way like portability. So to paraphrase Stanley Kubrick's classic, they learned to stop worrying and forget the bomb. They still are focused at traditional cinema market, which, as I mentioned, steadily grows in Poland about 10% per year. They have their harvest. They strive just to secure number of screens in cinemas in face of strong influences of distribution branches of Hollywood's Big Five, and they live here and now, and as I said, they stopped to worry the bomb. So the final point is, do they know more than us, or are they just short-sighted? Thank you.
Thank you very much to Marcin for those perspectives from the Polish film industry on the digital single market strategy. Our next paper is from Dr. Ulrike Rohn and Henry Laser from Tallinn University and Baltic Film and Media School. And I think the focus is going to shift now to the Estonian audiovisual production sector.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jillian, for this introduction. This is Henry Laser. I'm Ulrike Rohn. We're from, as Jillian already said, from Tallinn University in Estonia, and from the Baltic Film, Media, Arts and Communication School, short BFM. Oh, I'm opening the presentation now. And it's Center of Excellence in Media Innovation and Digital Culture, short MEDIT. That's our research center that we're working at. And we both work at a multi-year research project in which we are trying to understand the challenges, but also the opportunities that small media markets, especially audiovisual markets, are facing in Europe. And we just completed a study on the international production market, in which our question was, how easy or difficult is it for film producers from small countries, in our case, as a case study, Estonia, how easy or difficult it is for them to participate in the international production market, and then how do they support mechanism on EU level and national level support that actually or not. But now we are leaving the production network studies, and we are looking at audiovisual. We're looking at distribution. So now, on the next step in our research is going to be on online distribution in the EU and their changing regulatory frameworks, and we're looking at them from a small market perspective. So we are very much in the beginning of this sub-study and within our larger research project, and we can base our research on previous research in our center, as well as our production market study already also gave some of the insights that are useful for understanding distribution. But our main aim to be here is now to also, and also our presentation is to basically say what we will want to do and argue why we find it important to do, to research, and also to get in contact with others who are also studying the changing regulatory framework from the perspective of small markets, and to form collaborations and to also exchange knowledge and experience from a small market perspective. So the digital single market, this is also the topic of our presentation as it was the previous presentation. The digital single market is actually a very natural idea when you think about the main component of the EU economic policy as a single market, that, you know, there's a free exchange and that facilitates the free flow of labor, capital, services among member states. And if you take that philosophy of the single market to the digital area, that's a digital single market. So the European Commission says the digital single market aims to open up digital opportunities for people and businesses and enhances Europeans' position as a world leader in the digital economy. So this sounds all very good, but it's when we take it to the audiovisual market, it's very controversial because it kind of might conflict with existing practices of copyrights and existing business models. And we are specifically interested in how the effects of that may influence small markets, and especially thinking that the long-term policy aim of the audiovisual policy is to not only to facilitate cultural exchange, but to also strengthen audiovisual industries. So that means also that small audiovisual industries and small countries are also strong and independent. Why are we interested in small markets specifically? Well, small markets have a shortage of resources and a small domestic demand. They cannot make use of economies of scale, of economies of scope, as well as network effects, the same way that larger countries can. So they might be disadvantaged in international environment. At the same time, they're also dependent and vulnerable to the doings of few players and few actors and few large players. And they might be, and they are usually they have a high inflow of content and capital from foreign countries. In our research center, we already conducted study on small markets perspective on regulatory frameworks and its changing. I published together with Inrek Ibos, who is also here in the audience, and also works at our center, an article in the Internet Policy Review called "Sharing Killed the Audiovisual Media Service Directive STAR, the impossibility of European audiovisual media regulation in the area of the sharing economy." And here we are arguing for a convergence of the regulatory environment and saying that the Audiovisual Media Service Directive, as it is right now, is outdated because it does not include and consider all possible distribution forms online. And we're especially pointing to the emerging sharing platforms, video sharing platforms that make use, and they're so very much depend on the network effect. And when the market is open in the sense of the digital single market, then only the large players, the large global players will survive because of these network effects. Another publication that from our research center that comes from Inrek Ibos is published in the International Journal of Digital Television. It's called "The EU Digital Single Market on a Mission Impossible: Audiovisual Policy Conflicts for Estonia." And he's saying that if you look at the audiovisual regulatory environment and how it's changing, if you look at it from the small market perspective, then you do find the dilemmas of the regulatory and development. And he also makes uncovers the internal conflicts and struggles within the Estonian policymakers to find actually a positioning towards the new developments. So even on the national level, it's a bit controversial, and the various positions exist simultaneously. So as I said, we conducted the research so far, the empirical research so far that we conducted is on the production side of the international film market, film production. We conducted in-depth interviews with representatives from the Estonian audiovisual industry, and we conducted an online survey with foreign professional visitors at PEF. That's a Black Night Film Festival in Estonia, which is one of an A-category film festival. And we also conducted focus group interviews from interviews with foreign audiovisual industry, interviews for representatives from foreign audiovisual industries. And the main aim was basically to see how easy or difficult it is for small audiovisual industries to participate in the international production market. So the digital single market was not on our research topic here. However, especially the interviews, the expert interviews and the focus group interviews gave quite an insight of understanding how various representatives understood the digital single market. And we find it actually quite interesting, the confusion that exists among industry representatives regarding the new regulatory changes that are to happen or that did happen. So one of the interviews, for instance, said the problem is no one really is aware of the possible outcome of it, but I think it definitely makes sense from the kind of client point of view, but there are so many buts. Another one said that the digital single market may increase the demand of foreign products in Estonia, but not of Estonian products outside of Estonia. And she said, on one hand, it's kind of very logical, freedom to see everything everywhere. As we're making the small language films here in Estonia, I don't really believe that they are, automatically being distributed because there's a single market happening now. There just needs to be the will to see them. And another interview is in the Austrian sales agent. She referred to the decision that the portability would take place, and which did take place, is in force now since April. But portability was just one idea on one part of the digital single market strategy. And she would just refer that now that it's just the portability, then everything else won't happen because I think it's now done. So it's clear that it will not happen, referring to the harmonization of copyright laws. Knowing there was a decision last week or 2 weeks ago, so I think that you never know. So you never know what will come up again. So it kind of really reflects the insecurity and unsureness about what's going to happen, how this will affect, and what it actually means. I also was at this EU presidency conference in Estonia called Pictured Futures that took place in November last year. And there was one session that was very relevant, called The Future of European Content Policy. And for research reasons, I recorded that and transcribed this session, and I found quite confusing statements by some of the panelists. One's stating the obvious, there is a disbalance of risk because some countries don't have the same chances of refinance. Well, this basically just says also that we do need to see how the changes affect small markets and small industries because they might have different risks. So that's just reinforcing our research idea. Another one says, there are so many people against the digital single market, so why still think about it? The other said even digital single market is an example of fake news. And the other one, solutions need to come from the market and not from the policy. So you really see that the confusion in the market. And so we all sat here to study the implications of the digital single market and to untangle it, and especially for small markets like Estonia. And we also want to frame it within the theoretical context. And there are a lot of dialectics that we can refer that exist in the digital single market that are related to it, that we can refer to the theoretical part of our work. And that's what Henry will be introducing us now to. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so thank you. So indeed, why do we study this? The Digital Single Market Policy Initiative and Development is a dynamic process that's going on right now. And so we wanted to take a look back at what are the theories, what is the theoretical background for researching the digital single market? What are the tensions among stakeholders and what we call dialectics? And lastly, who are these stakeholders and what are the issues that are important to them? So first off, I wanted to mention modern, and I wanted to list some of the scholars that have contributed work to inform our research. First off, Van Dyke, a networked world that is both social and individualized. So clearly he's talking about how the digitalization and modern technologies affect social actors and society in general. Then from McQuail, 2000, social change from new technologies. So how is society affected from a general perspective, of a meta view, if you will, by these changes in technology? Second, we want to talk about globalism and imperialism. And those together, I think, fit into kind of one box. Globalization, we look at what we call now the five horsemen of the United States, the Amazon, YouTube, Apple, Facebook. And so we see that there's a strong interest on how that affects individual markets and especially small markets. Thompson in 95 says that it's inextricably linked with the ideology of consumerism. And so we look to consumerism as, well, a driving force, and it's certainly the paradigm for these big, massive platforms that are intrusive all over the world. And secondly, Sophitis, social space is deterritorialized, and that is the basis for portability and what's got traditional market players so upset. So in terms of imperialism, Boyd and Barrett, as was mentioned earlier, Western values imposed on less developed nations, standard imperialism of the media type. And McChesney, who is a respected author for the United States, the internet has become an agent of monopoly. So, continuing, cultural policy. We haven't really talked yet about the value of culture in these debates. It's all been about markets and about money and stakeholders, but culture is an important and valuable issue that needs to be addressed. Mulcahy, aesthetic enlightenment, enhanced dignity, and educational development are all part of the digitalization process, and we have to retain those to preserve our culture in this time of transformation. Next is political economy. Again, the critical theorist Herman and Chomsky, media as instruments to maintain status quo. We've talked about status quo. Market makers want status quo. Some big platforms want status quo. Others want change. There's Moscow, 2008. Network economy forms its own power relationships. Do we let the market dictate it, as Ulrika said, or is it policymakers that need to step forward in the fore? Small market, then we talk about dialectics. And these are tensions that we've identified which inform our exploration into this DSM development. National versus supranational market mechanisms. Puppis is probably one of the leading authors in this area. And we know what this represents in terms of the battle for sovereignty versus the strength of, and this is not just a Central Eastern European issue, this is a EU-wide issue and changing day to day. Small market versus large market, that's been talked about a little bit. Let's go to cultural versus commercial. This is, again, the value of culture we feel is an important question. Michaela says EU policy output is centered on economic and competition priorities. Is the EU only interested in markets? Schroff and Street, EU intervention threatens the diversity of European music culture. So, can we protect culture in this digital transformation? And lastly, from Ibris, Estonia tends to prefer EU liberalization of the internet economy at the expense of cultural diversity locally. I want to go to the pluralism versus hegemony. Robin Mansell in 2015 in a paper said, the new emperors diminish media plurality. Of course, it's YouTube, it's Facebook, these new digital emperors. Ibris again, oligopolistic, as in oligopolies, structures in Europe's small media markets. So the small media markets tend to become oligopolies over time. And so where's the pluralism in that? And Anderson, demand exists for local culture in audiovisual content. So small markets and small cultures still have diversity of value. Last but not least, let's do Central Eastern European versus Western Europe. This is a strong dialectic that we've experienced. Support for political and social institutions among the lowest of all European states, according to Rupnik and Zielonka, that in Central Eastern Europe, institutions have little support. And here's a good quote from O'Sullivan that I'll finish with. Tussles with Brussels are not about being anti-European, but a battle of what it means to actually be European. So Central Eastern European states, societies, ponder that question. Yeah? So, here are the subjects of examination. We're running short on time, but you can see that these are the stakeholders and these are issues for each that we've identified as important. As we go, this could be changing. It's dynamic. It's what we're interested to explore. So, thank you very much.
To say a couple to the conclusion. Yeah, so this is, we will be studying to understand the digital single market from the Estonian point of view as a case study. And our next step will be definitely be looking into the local stakeholders' attitudes, expectations, and experiences to the digital single markets and in effect. So we'll be looking into the agents in the industry's value chain, but also to be questioning and doing research with policymakers. And our main aim here is to as I said in the beginning, especially to establish contacts with others who are doing similar work in other small markets. And I just wanted to briefly also bring up something that Peter nicely mentioned, the book series from the Springer book series, series and media industries. And as Peter said, the book that will be coming out of this research that's supported by you. So we are really hoping that this book will be published in this book series. I'm one of the editors together with my colleague Björn von Rimscher. I will have flyers out there there's a small brown table and they're laying out there if you want to read more about the book series and if you might want to also publish something and you're looking for a publisher, that could be a good series for you. Okay, thank you very much.
You just can't get away from advertising, can you? Anyway, thank you. Thanks, Ulrika and Henry. Interesting to hear those perspectives from Estonia. And also, you've introduced some theoretical perspectives, and that's, I'm sure maybe Paul Zaharadka, who's going to give our next paper, will be continuing in that ilk. I'm going to hand it straight over.
Thank you very much for the introduction. My paper will be a philosophical one, not an empirical one, because I think we need more philosophy in this debate on digital single market. Probably some of you happened that you were trying to access video which is offered by a service provider in another country and your access was refused. What has happened to you, it's called geo-blocking. Geo-blocking is quite widespread practice within the cultural industries or copyright industries, and that means that your access to the online content, which is mostly protected by the copyright, is refused based on the location you connect to the internet. And as you can see, geo-blocking is one of the main obstacles in digital single market debate. It does matter to the European Commission, and European Commission is working now on so-called digital single market strategy, which is trying to unify the digital market, and there is a bundle of regulations and directives, and 3 regulations are relevant in this respect for us. They concern the geo-blocking. The first one is already mentioned Portability Regulation. It enables you to take your online library, you subscribe to your country of residence, and to take it to another country. So you, even if you will leave your country, you will be able to use your online library. By the critics of this Portability Regulation, it's also called roaming for Netflix. So we still have a portability of online audiovisual services, but we don't have cross-border access to audiovisual content. Second piece of the regulation is regulation on online transmission. It makes more easy the process of right clearance in such a way that the distributor has to buy just one territorial license for the territory he is established, and he is allowed to broadcast the content through ancillary, so-called ancillary online services within the whole Europe. It's a catch-up TV and online broadcasting. However, this regulation is accompanied by contractual freedom, which means that the distributors are allowed to restrict this online broadcast by technical measures, which implies using geo-blocking measures. So even this kind of regulation is not able to deal with the problem of geo-blocking some of the consumers are facing. The last piece of legislation, geo-blocking regulation, it prohibits unjustified cases of geo-blocking, but copyright industries or copyright protected content is excluded from this regulation. So as you can see, geo-blocking is still an issue, and what I will try to do is to reflect on geo-blocking from ethical perspective, and because most of the studies were dealing mostly with economic impacts of abolishing geo-blocking measures on specific culture industries. As every inquiry, also a philosophical one has to have some kind of methodology, and this will be my methodology. I will be using a method of wide reflective equilibrium. What does it mean? I will try to identify relevant stakeholders in this debate and their moral claims. First of all, if the moral claims are in contradiction, I will try to balance these claims. That means that I will take into account pros and cons of the actions base of the particular moral claim. If the moral norms are too general, too indeterminate and general, I will try to specify conditions under which the norms should be valid. And last point, I will make a test of the coherence. That means the proposed solution of this moral dilemma, geo-block or not geo-block, should be in accordance with moral intuitions we all share in this all, firstly, and secondly, it should be also compatible with available facts. So who are the stakeholders in this debate? It's pretty clear, right holders in the first place, but what could be their moral claim? Does geo-blocking protect authors' rights? We have to have a look in the copyright, and if we have a look in the copyright, we see that there is a mention on right to use the work. But to use the work implies to be able to distribute it in a particular territory. It means to be able to rent the work, reproduce or make it available to the public. There is no mention about prohibiting or allowing access to the content made by a particular consumer. There is no such a right in the copyright. So that means that geo-blocking does not protect authors' rights in the first place. If it protects something, it's a moral legitimate claim for a fair remuneration for your creative work. So there is no connection, in my opinion, between geo-blocking and copyright. So if you, as a distributor, buy a territorial license for distribution of the content in particular territory, you are allowed to offer it in that particular territory, but you are not allowed to prohibit or allow the access by consumers to that content. So what does it mean? That these geo-blocking or measures which are requiring geo-blocking is just a supplement in the licensing agreements. It's not implied by the copyright as such. Okay. What about consumers? If they face the geo-blocking, what most of them do, they try to circumvent these digital invisible walls, for example, by using virtual private networks. And more than that, they also agree that they have a right to get to the content. If the content is not made available to them, they have to right to get to the content, to circumvent these geo-blocking walls. So does it mean that circumventing these geo-blocking walls is illegal? Yes, it is illegal because it's harming the contractual clauses or the terms of use. But does it mean that it is also unethical? And as you can see in the answers of the respondents we were making the interviews, they don't think so. They think it's quite okay if they do that. On the one hand, we have the right moral claim of the authors to be fairly remunerated for their creative work, and on the other hand, we have a claim of the consumers to take part in the cultural life. And these two moral claims are also reflected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as you can see behind me. And this second picture shows the same in a more quick way. Okay. So saying this, I would like to now make a short remark on the critical remark on copyright. If we acknowledge that the consumers' rights to take part in cultural life is a legitimate one, so how it is reflected in the copyright? And the answer is not much. If we have a look in the copyright, there is a mention on authors' rights, but the universal human rights are reflected only via limitations and exceptions from the copyright protection. So maybe we should reconstruct in the copyright in such a way that it's not a natural right which emanates from creative work of the author, but it's a social construct. It's an agreement between the author and the society, and the society is giving him temporary monopoly over the distribution of the first copy to the copyright holder, and in return the copyright holder should make his work available to so many consumers as possible. So maybe that would be a social function of the copyright, and it need maybe some revisions. But back to our business, I was talking about available facts and reasons, pro and cons geo-blocking. So what are the relevant facts? First of all, within the EU, the markets or the demand for audiovisual products is linguistically and culturally fragmented in the EU. First one. Second one, the copyright is territorial. Every country has its own copyright, and what does it mean? It enables to divide one act which is protected by the copyright in 28 different copyrights, which can be sold to 28 different subjects in 28 different countries. And that's my third point. That's also the way how the audiovisual industry is mostly functioning in the Europe. Why is that? Because also the why is that the principle of territoriality is like the cornerstone of the audiovisual sector? Because also the distributors are operating locally, first of all. Secondly, creating or producing a movie is a financially complex project, and you need to secure financing in advance. So you sell the territorial exclusivity license to the distributor in advance, so-called pre-sale. So that's the reason why. Okay, let's go to the next point. Okay, what's the role of exclusive territorial licenses in the audiovisual sector? It secures the territorial monopoly to the distributor. That's important because you have then only one subject in the territory who is promoting the film, movie. So there is no confusion between consumers. Secondly, you eliminate free rider problem. There is nobody else who would offer the content. So the distributor is willing to buy the license for the film, and finally the price for the premium content is available for a local distributor. He's not interested to buying content which he would distribute in the whole Europe. And the last effect of the territorial fragmentation of audiovisual markets in Europe is a price discrimination. You are able to offer the content for the price which reflects the purchasing power of a particular consumers in particular country. So, reasons to preserve geo-blocking in the audiovisual sector. One of the claims is there is no sufficient cross-border demand for the audiovisual content. If there would be any demand, the distributor would offer the content in the particular territory. Second claim, if we lose the territorial exclusivity, so that means that the exclusive territorial licensing would be no more possible because we abolish geo-blocking, it means that the distributors will not be willing to invest in the film production. So we destroy the concept of pre-sales of rights. Thirdly, there is a danger of cross-border cannibalization if there is no geo-blocking. So I will be not the only one who is offering the content online in a particular territory. So the commercial value of the territorial license will decline. It means less money in the business. It means also less production. Loss of cultural diversity. If there is no geo-blocking, so it makes sense to distribute the content in the whole Europe. So let's make movies who will appeal to the mass audience, and let's have these movies in major languages as English. Less localization and promotion of audiovisual content. It will be able to distribute the content in the whole Europe. Local distributors will not be able to pay for the content, yeah, and they are also not interested in doing this. So it means also less choice for the consumers. So you will be paying more for less probably, because also the prices of VOD platforms will have to align across territories, and probably the prices in lower income countries are now lower than in higher income countries. Reasons for abolishing geo-blocking in the audiovisual sector. First of all, it's a discriminatory practice. You are discriminated based on your nationality and place of the residence. And if you want to buy a bread in Italy, nobody is checking your ID and refusing you sell the bread. So why do we have this practice in an online world if we don't have it in an offline world? First point. Second point, geo-blocking locks creators. That means that they are depriving the creators of potential consumers who would be willing to pay for the content, but it's not possible for them. So they resort, for example, to illegal sources. Third point, a large share of European film is financed from public funds. Therefore, these films or audiovisual content should also be available to the Europeans. Point number 4, the symmetry requirement. If the copyright holder is free to decide where he will distribute or offer the content, the same freedom of choice should have also the consumers. They should be also able to decide in which market they will buy the content. And second point, if companies are able to take a profit from single market, they can profit from the freedom of a movement of capital, labor, goods, and services. So maybe they should also give something back to the market, the companies, and abolish geo-blocking. And point number 5, okay, of course we would have a better access to cultural diversity, because there's a saying, if a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? So what's the value of the culture nobody is perceiving or understanding because of digital walls? Next step, let's balance these two moral claims. First of all, my claim, there is an asymmetry in causal relationship between geo-blocking and moral aims which shall be achieved. It is pretty clear that geo-blocking is causing less audiovisual content available. But this causal relationship is not so pretty clear between geo-blocking and remunerating the authors. So maybe it increases the economic security. It secures his territorial monopoly for the distribution, but it's not the sure way how to be fairly remunerated. So if we accept the cross-border availability of audiovisual content as a legitimate interest on the part of the consumers, maybe our question should be not how to prevent DSM strategy, which is hurting the ecosystem of audiovisual industry, but maybe how should we change the business models of audiovisual industry and not to harm the interests of value chain actors. And if we do that, we are faced by 4 scenarios, which are also discussed nowadays within the digital single market debate. First one, I was already talking about it. This scenario, that's the regulation on online transmission, and this scenario would not change much, because it's accompanied by the contractual freedom to restrict the online transmissions. So I will not talk about it now. Second point, we can have a country of origin principle related to audiovisual services. It means one license for the territory you are established is enough to promote or offer the content within the whole Europe. However, there will be a prohibition on geo-blocking measures. And in my opinion, this regulation would lead to the disastrous consequences I was talking about. Homogenization of the offered audiovisual content, less financial resources for the film production, etc. I will not repeat the arguments. The third solution could be abolish geo-blocking only with respect to the last release window, to the so-called free-to-air window, when the content is broadcasted by the public or commercial broadcaster. But this kind of solution would not deal with the internet piracy, because the consumers want to have immediate access to the content after its first release in the country of its production. So probably it would not solve anything, this kind of solution. So my favorite scenario or proposition is number 4. Let's have a status quo. Let's have the territorial licensing in place, but let's allow the passive sales. What does it mean? It means that the content distributor is allowed to offer or sell the content to the so-called non-targeted territory. He's not allowed to promote the content in the non-targeted territory. It means in the territory he doesn't hold the license for. But if there is any consumers who are interested in the content, he has to sell it. And why do I think that this scenario would be a viable one? Because the market would segment not based on the national borders, but based on the linguistic and cultural differences we were talking about. First of all, and the audiovisual market or business models would gain the social actors who are now excluded. It means Erasmus students, linguistic minorities, cultural minorities, language learners, etc. These people who are not happy with the functioning of the audiovisual market would be attracted to the cross-border offer. Secondly, when we did the qualitative interviews on consumer behavior, we found out that the main category which is characterizing the consumption is a need for comfort. So it's not highly probable that the people will subscribe to another VOD service in another country if there are no big price differences. And even with Netflix, for example, as you already know, the price level is pretty the same in every country. So it's not highly probable that the consumers would migrate from local VOD service to another one in another country. However, there would be still a problem with markets with similar or the same language. There would be also a problem with sport events because there is no linguistic barrier which would prevent the cross-border migration of the consumers. And thirdly, we would also have a problem with co-productions with the countries, co-productions made by the subjects from countries with similar or the same language. Imagine a VOD platform in Austria and in Germany. The German provider has to pay much more money for the license than the Austrian one, but the German consumers could learn via social networks about the offer in Austria and could migrate to the provider in Austria. So I think this proposal should be accompanied by the list of justified cases of geo-blocking, such in the case of sport events and markets with same and similar language. And that's pretty all from my side. And here are a list of references I was using during my talk. Thank you.
Thanks very much to Pavel for those very interesting reflections on geo-blocking, the rights and wrongs of geo-blocking. So our last presentation is Dr. Radim Polchak, and he's head of the Institute of Law and Technology at Masaryk University. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm a lawyer. First of all, I wanted to say something about digitization and about the new paradoxes that we have in connection with this phenomenon. But first of all, I would like to react to what was said. This geo-blocking thing, this is absolutely unbelievable what happened in the European law, because these anti-geo-blocking laws effectively legalized geo-blocking. It was illegal before, because it was violating consumer protective rules, it was violating antitrust laws. Nobody was just claiming this is why it was existing. But that was illegal, and now, after anti-geo-blocking laws, it is actually legal in certain industries. That's unbelievable. And to those arguments of ethical nature, I would add an argument of natural nature, because there is a science called cybernetics that is originating in the 50s, in the last century, and that's about life and how life operates, and how to imitate life and how to imitate the organization in living organisms. And there is empirical proof that there are very few things more natural for humans than communicating and than using various means just to inform themselves. And therefore, it is not natural to block access to information. If you came to Prague 25 years ago, and if you were foreigners, then you would go to a pub, and then you would order a beer, and you would pay twice more for the beer than Czechs. It would just depend on how would you speak. And then the Czech government introduced harsh laws, and this is not happening now. Then those who charged these double prices, they were rioting, and they were saying, "You are ruining our business model," which was in fact true. The government was ruining the business model, and this is happening here. And I have one more note. It was from the Polish interviews that the distributor said that the European politicians, they have no idea what the market is about and what regulation is about, etc. My experience is different. I do not go, people who know me from here, they know that I do not go far for a critical statement, but as far as I can tell, about members of the European Parliament who are somewhat involved in drafting of these rules that somewhat involve the digital single market, it's about copyright, it's about media laws, etc. They have very good understanding of the issue, and I was extremely positively surprised when I saw how deep is their knowledge about it. And I'm not kidding you. I do not say it like sarcastically. I'm really serious. It is not about Czech politicians and Czech members of the Czech parliament, they have no understanding whatsoever apart from what they think is politics. But with the European Parliament, this is really different. And many of the members of European Parliament that I happen to meet had deeper understanding of the issue than our PhD students at my institute, for instance, which of course can say something about PhD students in our institute, but I really mean this positively. So, but my note is about those paradoxes that we have in recent or relatively recently introduced regulations about digitization. Now, digitization, that's the process through which you happen to have something in digital form, which was in other form. And we have a lot of cultural content stored by public institutions like archives, museums, etc. And we are now sitting in a theater that is also owned by what I just learned is a film archive. So this is one of these institutions that is funded by public money, and it holds substantial cultural content. Now, there used to be a European directive on reuse of public sector information. That directive regulates the way in which these publicly funded institutions use their data. And there can be data of various sorts stored in various ways. So it could be movies, it could be data about, I don't know, laws, for instance, are also this kind of data. Or it could be geographic data, it could be meteorological data, all sorts of data. If it is held by public sector bodies, then it is regulated. And there are some principles that govern this regulation. One of these principles is non-discrimination. The other principle is ban on exclusivity. So if you are a public body, if you have some interesting data, if somebody comes and says, I would like to use this data for commercial or uncommercial purposes, and if you give this data to that person for reuse, then you have to use the same conditions for any further institutions or subjects that are willing to use the same data. Now, these rules in the original version did not cover what we call cultural institutions. So these museums, archives, libraries, these are the most important institutions. Then we had an update of this directive, and this is the new version, as here on this side. And here you see that there are university libraries, and there are also libraries, museums, and archives that are covered with this directive. Now, with respect to digitization, the situation was these cultural institutions were exempt from the applicability of these rules, which meant that they could use exclusive agreements. Typical situation, a library. So there's a library and it has books, obviously. And then somebody, let's say we'll call him Google, comes and says, I will digitize your library. And I will digitize books that are not copyright protected because the copyrights have already expired. There are a lot of these books are stored in the libraries that are existing after, and it is beyond 70 years after the death of their authors. So Google offers these books to be digitized, and they said, we do not want anything in exchange. We just want you to promise us that the data that we will give you, you will not use any further. You will use them just for conservation purposes. Plus, and this is not what Google was doing, there were some other occasions, sometimes we also find exclusive agreements saying that you let us digitize this, you keep the data, you do not do anything with the data, and you promise us that you do not let anybody else digitize this. This is not what Google is doing. This was found in some other agreements. Now, when these cultural institutions were put under the scope of these new European rules, this practice would be banned because they couldn't promise this kind of exclusivity. They couldn't promise that they will not give the data to anybody else. So there was amended also Article 11, and this Article 11, that's the article that prohibits these discriminatory practices and these exclusive clauses, and it was amended by a statement saying that that paragraph, which was paragraph 1, shall not apply to digitization of cultural resources. But it was a bit too broad exemption, so the following text appeared there, and it is known as the Google exemption, for obvious reasons, because mostly these exclusive agreements are used by Google. And what it basically says is that this practice can continue. So the library or archive or any other establishment, cultural establishment that is funded by public money, can make exclusive arrangements with those who digitize their content. Exclusive arrangements mean that they will keep the data. This is what it says. The cultural institution will be given a copy of the data free of charge, but at the same time, this copy can be protected by non-disclosure agreements. So it would mean that at the end, you will have a library, then Google comes, scans the books, and the library gets these scans, but can't do anything with those data other than conservation, and then Google will be given the data, and then Google will have practical exclusivity on the use of this digitized content. Now, the paradox in this is that we have copyright laws. And the copyright laws, they say that you might have exclusivity on some content as long as the copyright exists. Now, after the expiration of copyrights, anybody is able to use the copyrighted work, previously copyrighted work. And here we have a situation when we have archives and other cultural institutions, museums and libraries. They do have cultural content that is not protected by copyrights. Now, if you digitize this content, then it can be made freely available to everybody, and anybody can make some use of it. Instead of that, we have a situation and we have a company that has exclusive control over this content, and this is legally possible. Now, this created three classes of cultural institutions. This is my personal classification. This you don't find in the laws. And now I recently wrote it in a chapter of a book, but because it is about to be published in Oxford University Publishing, and they said that they have certain policies. They said we shouldn't name cultural institutions rich, hopeless, or lazy. So I had to change my language. So in that chapter, it will be named in a bit different manner. But here I use the liberty to present it in the original form. So those rich, those are cultural institutions that can pay for digitization with their own money. This is the best case. I wouldn't say that my university is rich, but we were able to find money to digitize part of the content that is held by our library. In that case, that cultural institution is not limited in further use of that digitized content. So mostly what happens is that you then find it on the internet. That's the best case. But not everybody is rich enough, because sometimes, and especially when we speak about audiovisual content, digitization can be quite expensive in order to make like a digital picture of something which is in analog form. This can be really expensive. Most expensive are movies for obvious reasons. So these rich institutions, they can digitize in their own capacity. Second class are those who are hopeless, so those who are unable to get money for digitization of their content, of the content that they hold. Now, with these, we see that there is no alternative for them than to go and have their archive digitized for free by Google or by somebody else who offers this service in exchange for this exclusivity. So these hopeless are hopeless. They have no other way. Either they will not have digitized anything, or they will digitize it for free, so they will get the digital files, and they will promise exclusivity to those who digitized it. And this exclusivity, I do not blame those who offer this free service in exchange for exclusivity, because these are companies. Google is not a charitable institution. They have to make money. And the way in which they make money is through this exclusivity, obviously. So this is not about blaming Google. The most problematic is the third class of cultural institutions, those who are, I call them lazy, but they are, I would say, pragmatically lazy. These are institutions that would be able to get money for digitization, but they use that money for something else, and they digitize their funds for free. These are typically libraries, archives, public institutions that can use project funds. By the way, when I hear these cries about European Union ruining the local audiovisual production, then I think somebody should look at statistics, how much of this local audiovisual production that is ruined by the European Union is financed by various operational funds provided by the European Union. But anyway, so the libraries and archives and all these institutions, they can use project funds, but it is not easy to get projects. Those of you who are here from public institutions and who have some experience with projects, yes, like Petr and Pavel and others, now we have one project together. It is pain in the ass to produce project application and then to deal with all these formalities and administration and everything. So you have to invest into it, and you have limited resources. So you use these resources to invest into projects that bring you something where you do not have any alternative. While here, you do have this alternative of free digitization. Moreover, if we look at local cultural institutions, they are very often financed on basis of projects by local administrations. Here in Czech Republic, we have regions, so these regional administrations, they are awarding money to cultural establishments. And then it is difficult for a local cultural establishment to say, give me this local public money, and then I will make our content globally available. Because then the local administration has a point in asking, like, why should we give you local money for improvement of our local culture, local whatever, tourism, etc., and then you use it for something which will be for the global benefit? We're not interested in global benefits. So that's a valid argument. So in these cases, these cultural institutions, I shouldn't have named them lazy. They are pragmatically lazy or not willing to act. They opt for this free digitization, this digitization that leads to that exclusivity, instead of digitizing it for public money and then making it freely available. Now, there are ways how to get around it. In the Czech Republic, we try to create specific funding formats for digitization of public cultural resources. But again, it is project-based, and there is some administration associated with it, etc. Another way is also mandatory digital copies. So this is what we have, especially in books, where states are collecting mandatory copies for their public libraries. So here we can start collecting digital copies. Of course, these digital copies, it would not be possible to make them freely available, that's for sure, because they are copyright protected. But after the term expires, then these libraries, they will have these digital copies available, and there will be no need for extra expenses for their digitization, etc. So there are various ways how we can get around it. Now, I think that this whole thing that was discussed here, digital single market, and the arguments against digital single market, I think it illustrates those paradoxes altogether with the digitization and these new forms of exclusivity, etc. The biggest paradox is in the core of copyright law. Copyright law departed from 50s of last century from its original idea. The original idea of copyright was that if there is somebody creatively producing something, then the person should be remunerated in order to induce creativity and to reward creative minds. Now, what we created from it in the 50s and later is fetish for copies. Now we really have copyrights, but this shouldn't be copyrights. The original name of copyrights is author's rights, droit d'auteur. That's what names the purpose. It should be the rights of the authors, and it should be balancing the interests of authors, of those who create something, of the consumers, those who consume, and of the state, because that's the law of the state. Now, the recent copyrights are primarily focused on creating exclusivities and restrictions. So we assume that by restricting access, we will make money. And that's the problem. That's the problem of the business models. If the business model is based on restricting access, then it is not natural, and it departs from the original idea of copyrights, because the original idea of copyrights was, let's reward the author, not let's limit the access to the copyrighted work. But I'm afraid that we are not going to resolve this issue here in this theater today. So I'll stop by here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Radim. So now we're going to have a short response from Paul Steffen from the Focus Institute in Vienna, and then it's over to you for questions. Okay.
I was told my task here is to sum up the panel, which is kind of a broad task, and to say something provocative. I'll try. The panel was, for me, kind of split into two parts. And the first part was more directed towards market activities. And what do the markets do, and how would the market react on DSM? The second part was then taking much more into account also the function and the part the public plays in it. And I think both sides need to be looked at very carefully. In general, there was at the beginning a strong skeptic vibe towards digital, the DSM strategy, and I know that the same arguments also from Austria, usually from producers in the film industry, arguing that their business is built on territoriality and pre-sales, and that it would basically turn the whole system upside down. I haven't found any evidence for that. So if you keep pressing them, what would actually happen? What would actually change? It's very hard to find arguments. The other part is the subsidy part. And if we look at the subsidies, we can see that in Europe, also in the EU budget, 50% of the art and culture budget goes to the media program, which is the audiovisual program. There's a lot of money going into public money going into that, and I think if we talk about stakeholders, and that is what Pavel also brought up then, if we talk about stakeholders, we have to have the public, the taxpayers, in there as stakeholders. We can't leave them out because they are putting up the vast majority of the money we are spending in the film industry. Then there was a point of, then Pavel also made a point saying that exclusivity is not inherent into copyright. So you shouldn't be able to exclude somebody. Copyright should be used in a way that people can access the works. So in principle, yes, and that is also where in economics of copyright, there are kind of two trends. One is you have to have some sort of exclusivity in order to sell it. You have to make it scarce. You have to make it dear in order to sell it. On the other hand, you would like to make the duration of the copyright and the access, the duration as short as possible, the access as good as possible, because that is, in welfare economics terms, more efficient. But it's always in copyright, if we talk about copyright, it's always about a market, it's always about copies, it's always about exclusivity or excluding someone. You can't use copyright without it. Originally, you said that the copyright wasn't copyright, but the author's right. This is only partly true. So if you look at the first copyright legislation in 1709 in Britain, the Statute of Anne, this was not about authors at all. It's it's a European construct that came about 100 years later with the Enlightenment that focused much more on the author. But it always had both sides. And if you look at it from an economic perspective, you will see that they are very, very similar rights. The differences are often somewhere else in the actual author's rights. There was one issue that came up several times, and that is cultural diversity. And I think that is a little bit the key and of the whole discussion, also how it balances it all. We have, on the one hand, we have a market. On the other hand, we have a strong culture of subsidizing culture. We are subsidizing culture to have cultural diversity. So if we do that, we produce things we think are good for our country, our region, our city. It's, if you want, public demand. On the other hand, we have a market, and those markets are heavily dominated by US film industry. So the problem now is, on the one hand, you don't want people in your country to miss out on access to whatever the entertainment industry offers. On the other hand, you will also want to keep producing your own works and local productions. And this is something that needs balancing. And I think this is the most important thing. How can we balance, on the one hand, copyright law, and on the other hand, subsidies, and what comes out of the subsidies? And there's just one mention of one thing that wasn't in any of the presentations, and I was kind of wondering about that, and that was the mentioning of net neutrality. So in August 2015, I think it was, net neutrality was, agreed on in the EU to a very okay extent. But this, in December 2017, the net neutrality was abolished in the US. And it is very likely that lobbyists will come and try to abolish net neutrality also in the EU again. And without net neutrality, we don't need to worry about all the other stuff, because if we don't have net neutrality, if we have channels, if we have walled gardens, if we have free internet for GAFA, meaning Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, and all that, then we can produce whatever we want. We won't get it on the net, because we won't have an internet as we know it, and we won't have this kind of cultural diversity anywhere in the internet, at least not where the people will be, because they will be in a free internet. They don't pay anymore any access to, because it's paid through GAFA. So if we don't defend net neutrality, and I think that is the basis for the whole debate, then we don't need to worry about digital, the DSM strategy at all anymore. So that was some.
Okay, we've had 4 very insightful papers. We've had some provocations, very skillful filleting there from Paul. And now I'd like to open the discussion up to the floor. I think we may have a roving microphone. Do we have a roving microphone? Okay, so if you'd like to ask a question, please put your hand up and please introduce yourself.
Well, hello. I will just get up. My question is topic that I think mostly hard, and the fourth option that you were describing,
So thanks for the question. Regarding the first scenario, it means monoterritorial licensing is still in place, but it's accompanied by the so-called passive sales. That means that the distributor is allowed to distribute the content in the country he bought the license for, but he is not allowed to refuse so-called unsolicited requests by consumers from non-targeted or non-licensed territories. So there is no geo-blocking anymore. I hope this is understandable. And regarding the AVMS directive, from my point, it doesn't deal with non-accessibility, cross-border non-accessibility of the audiovisual content. Where does it help that it requires 30% of European content which will be offered in the library? And maybe it deals also with forum, so-called forum shopping, that there are some companies who choose the place of their residence according to the regulation, which is the most profitable for them. And then they are targeting other countries. Like, for example, Netflix, they chose Amsterdam as a place of their residence. And what was not possible to tax the revenues Netflix or other companies are making in these targeted countries. And with AVMS, it should be possible also to tax the revenues they are making in other countries than the countries of their establishment. So I see it as a possibility how to improve, for example, a public fund of state cinematography fund in Czech Republic if Netflix will be charged for their revenues.
Do you have another question?
I am one, okay, introduction. Ivan Hronec, Film Europe, established in 1920. No, I'm joking. We just been inspired. I have one question to the audience and then one question to each of the panelists. Am I allowed to do this? Very short. All right, how many distributors are here? The traditional one? Raise the hands. All right, so we are like most likely 2 companies, right? Which is significant. I don't know, I don't have the answer, but definitely, I mean, there is something wrong. I mean, we most likely are either not interested to listen or we are having a fair or something like this. And the subsequent question is going to Marcin. Did you find actually some in between line reason why Gutek and the rest of the Polish distributors are so against it? I mean, is it a pure protectionism or is there any logic, right? That's the question to Poland, to Estonia, if you don't mind. I mean, you did not, in a way, mention your big neighbor, right? Which is Russia, obviously. And as far of openness, I mean, don't you feel that it might be something which you might be at least afraid of? The question to Czech Republic. We are a test scenario for digital single market because we are still Czechoslovakia in terms of the buying the rights. I mean, there is no one distributor who is actually buying the rights just for Czech Republic. We all are buying the rights for Czechoslovakia, and we are glamorously using Czech language in Slovakia despite the national proudness of Slovakia. So there is actually in existence for many years. I mean, I would love to have your remarks on that. You changed that, yeah. Now you are Radim, exactly. As far as the natural value of the ecosystem, let me just add that besides the shareness of the communication, there is one strong element which is called territoriality, right? So if, I mean, the life is so rich that you can find any example if you are having a need to find the example. So the territoriality is also the part of the ecosystem in a nature life, as a matter of fact. And I don't think that we have one person left without the question.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And the significant part of my paper was just to attempt to reconstruct the ways of reasoning and the ways of thinking and why they are so against. And I want to use the opportunity of answering your question also to address to this remark about the crying about Europe destroying the film industry, which is founded by Europe mainly. And I think that's why I mentioned that the DSM debate is the opportunity to rethink or reframe our thinking about European industry, because since many years there is this feeling of the crisis of global Hollywood, of being just the minor industry. And I think this debate shows us that distributors seems to be quite okay with the current reality, and that the current European reality is very comfortable, very friendly surroundings for them. So all these funds are very well known, and they know how to behave in the current market reality. The profits are quite okay. That's why, probably because the market is growing, and I'm not sure it's still the very small market, and they just don't need another endeavor or another adventure because they feel perfectly all right with status quo. So I think it's my assumption, because there is not clear in their arguments, but that's my assumption. And also I think it was really stunning, and tried to put it at the end of the paper, that they felt that they are in the pure free market economy. So all these subsidies, all these very useful resources of Creative Europe and so on, I think they used to it so much that they are so natural that even it's difficult to notice. So that's this, I use this term false consciousness, that it's like this private free market economy. All these European funds are just behind the head and we are not thinking about it. And why DSM is destroying something which is working very well, it's so nice, it's so good. So how to destroy something which is working well. So that's why I was quite surprising during the interviews, because my PhD was about global Hollywood, about all this Toby Miller stuff and something like that, and I had this feeling that Europe is in market crisis. But then it appeared that for the market players there is no crisis. Everything is all right, public funds are all right, and it's so natural that we don't need to think about something other. And also just one remark about this difference among Czech Republic and Poland, because as far as I know, the part of the Czech distribution is trying to establish their own VOD services, and in Poland there is even no preliminary thinking about it. So VOD is just going to another part of the market. So it's my assumption that reality is so good and so nice, how to destroy it by improvements which could be destroyed for them.
So a question concerning Czech and Slovak market as a laboratory experiment for DSM. I think it's a good point. However, there is one difference. Mostly there is one subject which is operating within the both markets, Czech and Slovak. And this one subject is able to synchronize the release window. So there is no problem with cross-border cannibalization of the revenues within particular windows. In comparison to that, there are markets like Germany, Austria, or France, or Belgium, which are operated by more subjects, and for them it could be more difficult to synchronize the distribution chain. So therefore, for them, the digital single market could present a problem.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, you notice I didn't talk about Russia. And some for others, maybe a piece of information. Estonia has a 27% population minority of Russian-speakings people, and when I talk about the Estonian film industry, I only refer to it as an Estonian language film industry and not the Russian, because there is no Estonian Russian film industry as such. But when you use the word, if we are not concerned on regard to Russian and openness to Russia, that was more on the broadcast level when it comes to news and current affairs program. And Estonia has now, since I think 2016, Estonian language, Russian language public broadcaster, which broadcasts out of Estonia. And that's very important, because before that didn't exist. So all the news and current affairs that Russian people were looking at or watching mainly came from out of Russia and not from Estonia. This concern regards more the broadcasting, and we do have a Russian language channel now. When I speak about the Estonian language or Estonian film industry, then it's Estonian language film industry. A quick comment to Radim as well, because you mentioned, and you're absolutely right, that when you're saying that the small markets, small industry as Estonia, they are profiting, and for them it's very important to get EU support, like for media on Euromage, to produce something, to make something big on the big screen. And otherwise, many of these Estonian movies, actually all of them Estonian movies, and I think last year it was 11 Estonian movies were produced, and all of them, I think, were, or not all, but at least a high percentage were supported by, publicly supported by the EU fundings, Euromage and media. So this is really important, because the resources are just not there and one needs to get into co-productions to produce things and to bring them on the large screen. But however, I also want to say that it's not more easy, or it's not easier for small countries to get these fundings than it is for other countries. So if you're getting together in a co-production team and you're applying for these fundings, then it's not, just because you're coming from a small country, you don't have any advantage. You're competing as other countries as well. So that's, I think, important to mention. I did have also a question to you, but I think I forwarded first to you before you forget your other question.
Thank you. First, you're exactly right about this funding, and that is the way how we can support culture. But the problem is when we say that we have copyright law to support culture, it is not the purpose of copyright law to support culture. The purpose of a copyright law is to create intellectual property rights, and intellectual property rights are in order for people to make money. Not to support any culture, not to beat terrorism, not to whatever, create better world. That's not the purpose of the copyright law. So this is the way, and also as Pavel mentioned, the taxation and associated issues, that is where we should focus, not into copyright law, because copyright law doesn't have the tools to protect culture. And yes, that question, there is no natural link between information and territory. Internet is very natural creation. It is very natural for humans to create things like internet. And the only element in life that is linked with territory is me, because I hate traveling. I don't like going to Prague from my hometown, Brno.
Okay, thank you. I also wanted to say, when we talked about the film, the production schemes, from EU, the media, Remark, and we also, Paul is your name, right? You mentioned subsidies and public access, and I want to say that there's no obligation if you get together in a co-production team, and then there's no obligation from the minority producer then also to distribute whatever has been produced in that corporation in the minority partners. So this is, sometimes it might actually not be efficient, or they don't bother to distribute. So if you think about it's EU money and everyone who pays to it, then actually everyone, at least the countries who are part of the production, the audience should be able to access this. So there are a lot of conflicts and paradoxes around. And mentioning the conflicts and paradoxes, Radim also mentioned that apparently the members of the European Parliament that you've been talking have a clear idea about the regulatory changes, the options and the effects. However, when I talked to the industry people in Estonia, and also at this industry event where I brought in some quotations or quotes here on the screen, there was a huge confusion about what this all means. Where are we standing? Where are we going? And what are the possibility outcomes? I mean, we are trying to figure that out, but we are spending a lot of time doing that. This is our job, trying to do this. But the industry is not, they are doing other things as a side thing. They're producing stuff. So but if there is a clear understanding and, when I can report back that, the people I talk to, there's confusion. So there seems to be a lack of translation, and not language translation, but a translation into context, and then well, what does it all mean? So where's the gap? Where's the lack? Where's the failure in terms of communicating everything? And how couldn't that be improved?
I think this is the problem, that there is good understanding of the issue. We know where the problem is, but we don't know how to resolve it. And that is the problem, because this is what the industry is asking, this is what consumers are asking, like, where is the solution? And that's the problem, because nobody knows the answer. So that's what I meant. They know what the issue is, and they do not see it only from the perspective of the distributors. And I think that here also the problem is that the voice that is being heard in terms of lobbying is distributors. But there is no voice of consumers. Forget about consumer associations, or forget about any like establishments like that. There is nothing existing, and there is nothing heard. And there is no voice of the authors. Distributors say we represent the interests of the authors. That's not true. Not even the producers. The producers, they also say we represent the interests of the authors. That's also not true. The authors should represent their interests, but their interests are not represented anyway. So that is the problem that I see. In the translation, I do not think that it is necessary for general public to have like precise information about ways of thinking in every committee of the European Parliament. There might be some lack of communication of like simple statements, but here the problem is that we can simply define the problems, but we can't simply define solutions because we don't have them. So that's the problem.
Okay, so the confusion that Ulrike spoke about there may to some extent reflect the fact that this Digital Single Market Initiative, like so many other EU initiatives, is an embodiment of a wish to represent a number of different aspirations. So the part of the stated strategy is to liberalise, but at the heart of it there's a very strong protective impulses as well, and a wish maybe to promote local industry. So there are a number of competing aspirations at work there, and I think that's what we're seeing played out here. We are now approaching lunchtime, and I think it's fair to say that the papers that we've had have shed a lot of light on the digital single market strategy in the context of small markets, but also on issues wider and beyond, and thank you for that. So, assuming there are no more urgent questions, I'm now going to draw this to a close, and thank you very, very much for those excellent papers.